I had the privilege of having breakfast with Saint Mother Teresa. I would say Mass for her sisters in the South Bronx, very bad neighborhood, once a week. And sometimes when the saint was in town, she would ask to have breakfast with the priest would say Mass. And so I did have Mass with her. And she said, she, of course, always talked about the poorest of the poor. And then I thought, gee, today, the poorest of the poor are not those with distended bellies, but those who have distended souls, who have not been fed with the truth of Christ's Holy Church.
Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
And we're delighted to be joined once again by our friend Father Perricone. You're welcome.
My pleasure, Catherine, to be with you and Mark again. Thank you.
It's great. It's great that you could be with us and spare the time, Father. A friend of ours was just recently in the US Capitol listening to a talk you were giving. You're giving a lecture and signing copies of your new book, which people must pick up if they haven't already, Torches Against the Abyss. And they said that was a wonderful event.
It certainly was. It was quite thrilling to be in the United States Capitol. My nephew happens to be chief of staff for one of the congressmen. And as soon as my book was issued by Ossusti Press, he asked me if, gee, wouldn't it be nice for you to come to the Capitol and give a lecture on it? Oh, my goodness, wouldn't it be nice? It would be wonderful. And interestingly enough, he and a few other members of the Capitol, this would be those mid-20s staffers for senators and congressmen. Well, a group of them started what is called Catholic staff members of the Capitol. And they started an organization, and there are quite a few of them. And interestingly enough, Mark, I would say over half of them, according to my nephew's calculation, all attend the traditional Mass. And there they are working on the Capitol. For instance, one of their exercises every Monday morning, they get together as a group and say the Rosary.
Wonderful.
And then they go to their various offices and they begin their day. And a very impressive group. So they sponsored it along with the Arlington Latin Mass Society, where I had lectured in Virginia. And they sent out the invitations, and people had to RSVP in order to get into the Capitol. It was an awful lot of security, and had a lovely room. In fact, the initial room that was slated for my lecture was too small because they had 70 staff members, these young fellas, that had RSVP'd, as well as some people from the Arlington Latin Mass Society. And so they graduated us to another larger room. And the whole thing was quite exciting. I gave some initial remarks. I read one of my articles that would appeal to, well, they are Catholics, but I guess they're more interested in my writings reflecting on the problems in the culture, especially the politics in America. And I have several of those. And I read one of those, and I think I captured their attention. Then we had a very exciting Q&A. These are very bright Catholic kids, and their questions were very well phrased and very well thought out. And then I had the book signing. The whole evening, at least to me, was a smashing success, Catherine. So I was very pleased with the way it went.
That's wonderful. Can you give us an idea of the type of questions you were being asked, Father?
Interestingly, they were asking me out how young Catholics can navigate the current problems in the church. Why were they happening? Oftentimes they will say, Father, why were we cheated out of this beautiful patrimony of the church? And sometimes that is accompanied by a certain amount of anger, Mark. They look at the grandeur of the old Mass, and they want to know why. So that's one of the questions. Another question, interesting, was, I a very Orthodox priest, right? I go to Mass, And when we talk to him about the problems in the church, he just poo-poos all of it and says, listen, you should simply try to be a saint where you are in the conditions that God has placed you, and don't worry about the rest. And I had to take issue with that, Catherine. I said, of course, that's how you become a saint, within the conditions that God has placed you, and going about your work with heroic excellence, ad meotum Dei gloriam every day. I said, but remember, there was also the commission by our Lord that you were to care for the least of his brethren. And so part of holy charity and part of your sanctification is to look to the least of your brethren. And I remarked to him, who is the least of the brethren today? Yes, you'll take care of the physically poor. You'll take care of the physically hungry. But the real one who's the least of the brethren is the Catholic who's been robbed of the faith through no fault of their own. I mean, they're the ones with starving souls. They're the ones who have lost the way to heaven because for 60 years they have been taught that heaven is here on earth, political utopias. And the whole notion of the supernatural has been erased from their understanding. And then I remarked to them that I had the privilege of having breakfast with Saint Mother Teresa. I would say Mass for her sisters in the South Bronx, very bad neighborhood, once a week. And sometimes when the saint was in town, she would ask to have breakfast with the priest would say Mass. And so I did have Mass with her. And she said, she of course always talked about the poorest of the poor. And then I thought, gee, today, the poorest of the poor are not those with distended bellies, but those who have distended souls, who have not been fed with the truth of Christ's holy church. And those are the ones that holy charity requires we go out and, like the Good Shepherd, place them on our shoulders and bind up their wounds and feed them with sanctifying grace. I said to the audience, do you know one of the greatest acts you can perform is bring one of these young Catholics or older Catholics who have lived in this state of deprivation and bring them to a Catholic church and tell them something you might think is obvious, but they don't know. You see that tabernacle? There resides the King of Kings, the incarnate Word. And therefore, what we do as Catholics is bend our knee. And I said, you will fascinate them because this would be something utterly alien to them. And I think the audience of young men and women listen to this, almost in rapt wonder. That is an idea, Father. So I said, yes, part of your central act as Catholics to achieve sanctification is in the place that God has put you. But then remember, you have to go out in holy charity to those that need your grace or your presence through Christ's grace the most. And remembering what St. Thomas said, that the greatest act of charity is to tell men the truth. So he sat and finally understood. I didn't want to cast aspersions on the good priest who gave him direction. But I think so often priests want to back away from the dust of the battle, Catherine. And I know them. And they're good priests. But they have forgotten that the dust of the battle is the work of priests and of good Catholics, as it was for all our forebears. We can't merely be thinking about ourselves. That's the essence of selfishness. And to merely pray for those souls who have been deprived of everything is not sufficient. That's the heresy of quietism, Catherine, condemned in the 17th century, which simply stated that, yes, all you need do is pray, and God will do all the rest. No. Mother Church said that is a heresy. Remembering what St. Augustine had written, that the God who saved us without us, or the God who redeemed us or created us without us, will not save us without us.
Wonderful stuff.
So, I'm sorry.
Well,
It was
no,
wonderful.
as before, viewers absolutely loved your last visit with us, and it's just wonderful to hear you speak. I love that as well, Mark. We got sometimes when the saint was in town. How many people are interviewing someone on their podcast and they say sometimes when the saint was in town? But it's a reminder to us that we're all called to be saints. This shouldn't be a rare occurrence.
No.
That's what we're.
And of course, Catherine, this month of November, if we're not going to get about the work of becoming saints here on earth, then please God, if we die in the state of sanctifying grace, but are not yet perfected, we'll have to do that time in purgatory.
Yeah.
Mm.
Remembering that, and imagine that's in our control. You can carve out your part in heaven right here by virtue of your free choices, heroic choices. So you take off a lot of that time in purgatory. So let's be practical Catholics. Get the work done now of sanctification. So it won't have to be done later for us. It's done by us now.
I think it sort of brings us on to the topic of your latest article in Crisis magazine, which you could, I kind of thought is almost like Quo Vadis, Petrus, where are you going, Leo? What is this actually all about? And I've really noticed that we've seen now you have consistently spoken out in very erudite articles that you've written. You've never been quiet. But there does seem to be, would you say, a bit more like, and now it's like we've gone through the Francis desert, which was a disaster. There's no other way of putting it.
No.
But now under Leo, it's almost like quite a few people seem to be saying, right, we've had enough now. We've had enough of this nonsense. We're not going to put up with it. And we see quite a few good clergy putting their heads above the parapet. Would you say that that's a phenomenon that you've observed, Father?
More and more. And Deo gratias, right?
Absolutely.
I think their eyes are being opened, indeed, without being disrespectful, but simply being historical. Pope Bergoglio's pontificate case can be made. It was the worst in the history of the Catholic Church. Having said that, put that aside. I think our Lord recognized that we had to have our faces almost, dug into the dust in order to wake up and see, oh my goodness, and begin to move forward. During his pontificate, you see, all of you, like me, were raised to have absolute reverence for the office of Peter. I remember when I was growing up, we had the Bible, very beautiful Bible, and I grew up in the 50s, so much older than you, Catherine and Mark. And sometimes I would take the Bible out and look at it. Most of the time I was reading my catechism. But anyway, look at that. And the front page of the Bible was this glorious color photo of Pope Pius XII. And I would look at him and gaze at him, and there in all his pontifical regalia. And I would say, Mom, who is this? And she would simply say to me, he is God. It's a very unsophisticated, but she was onto it. He is the vicar of Christ. So I grew up with as all Catholics did, a great reverence of the office of Peter, which is the reason why it would give us so much pain in the pontificate of Pope Bergoglio, because he seemed to be, in so many ways, degrading it. The best way to put it. So when he died, God rest his soul, we were hoping for some kind of a respite, a moment where we could catch our breath. And while he seems to want to continue the sad legacy of his predecessor, he's not his predecessor. So we have to begin with that. He has a much milder temperament. He's not nearly as vindictive. So those are pluses. We have to look to see if we could find pluses, Mark.
Yeah, the pejorative language has gone, hasn't it? A lot
All
of
of it,
pejorative
yes.
language, yeah.
Yes, and that harsh language and the condemnatory language. But he's still kind of, I think, Bergoglio light. So when I saw some of the statements he had been making in the first month of his papacy, I was a little bit alarmed because there were those ghosts of Bergoglio coming back. And I thought, well, I have to address this because I'm always thinking about our Lord refers to all of us as his little ones. And that's not chronological, it's spiritual. And especially priests, as alter Christos, have to take care of our Lord's little ones. And that's protecting them against error, and no matter where it comes from. So I thought it was an obligation of me as a priest to say something about these ambiguous or tendentious things that he was saying. But then the question is, how do I say it without in any way decreasing in the mind of the little ones reverence for this divine office? So I came upon this literary technique as of pleading for understanding from the Holy Father, where I was still able to put before Catholics some of the things that he was saying that were either ambiguous or false, and then refuting them ever so charitably and gently, again, for the sake of good Catholics, without in any way showing disrespect to his office. That's the technique I was trying to use for the article. And then I used certain instances of things that he had said and trying to elucidate them for Catholics, again, without them feeling dejected or eliciting in them a spirit of disrespect, because that was a big problem under Pope Bergoglio. How do we critique? And every day there was something to critique, Mark. How do
we tried. I mean, lots of people, academic people with the proper qualifications, tried, bishops and cardinals, but they were ignored, weren't they? And you know that leads to a heating up of the rhetoric, unfortunately, doesn't it?
Precisely. I could remember one of my dear Dominican friends, whose name shall be unmentioned, who's a professor at Cambridge. You might know who he is.
Yeah, I know who he is immediately.
Immediately signed his name early in the papacy, especially I think was after Amores Laetitia, that he was trespassing on the ground of heresy. And I thought, oh my goodness, Father such and such, I put his name here, and he's one of our most brilliant theologians. But he was pushing us in that direction. And no matter what good, look at the Cardinals of Dubia. Probably you're thinking of that right now. Cardinals that you try to put in the most, frame in the most reverential ways, clarify for it. Please help us. Nothing. So I wrote this article, and this is the first time I've ever, in any of my writing, actually addressed by name a pope was creating some kind of theological disturbance. But I thought that I was doing it in a way that still came across as honoring the office. That was the technique I was trying to use. I don't know if it was successful, Catherine. I hope it was.
I think it was. Father, in your article, you draw a line between the assent of mind and will, like from magisterial pronouncements, and respectful attention for other papal statements. How do you think ordinary Catholics can practically discern which papal utterances merit which level of response, especially when the lines feel blurred in a new, more sort of poetic papacy?
Anytime a pope is stepping upon issues that are merely the right of Catholics, that would be prudential issues, that is one of the ways where a Catholic knows that he is to give respectful attention and move his own way, recognizing that this pope is merely giving a suggestion on a potential issue, which he ought not to do, and popes never did until Pope John the 23rd, for instance, in Pacem Terris, talking about the conduct of nations. I mean, that's not the role of the Vicar of Christ. He merely has to get us to heaven. Conduct of nations are the provenance of, Catholic laity. So in that case, one would give respectful attention to the Vicar of Christ and then go their way. I'll never forget, after Pacem Terris, and another encyclical where he was trying to delve into economic matters, Roncalli, Mater Magister, William F. Buckley, in National Review, a very conservative political magazine in America, and Buckley being a very faithful Catholic, read that encyclical and was a bit irate at his intrusion into matters that were all the domain of the laity. And he devoted many of the articles, one issue, to that. And the cover, and people could look this up, the cover of that issue simply said, Mater si, Magister no, referring to this particular encyclical. So, to your question, Mark, how are Catholics to determine in prudential matters? And so, for instance, with all due respect to the Roman Pontiff, the silliness that he's coming out with about immigration. Catholics are simply to say, I respectfully listen to you, but I don't take that. I don't accept it because that's merely the province of laity. That's one thing. And even if he's using one of the highest instruments of his office, that would be an encyclical. Because it is an encyclical, doesn't mean that a Catholic has to imbibe every single sentence that is in the encyclical, if it is not merely a restatement of what has been the deposit of the faith in the past. When we have that, then we give assent of mind and will. But if in that encyclical he seems to wander into issues that are merely to be left to the laity, then a Catholic recognizes, here I am not bound to obedience, because he's not restating some element of the deposit of the faith, and let them go off with clear conscience and saying, oh, he's clearly off on this. That's what I was trying to point out in the article.
So it's not really sort of the domain of the popes to tell us when we can and can't use air conditioning, for example.
Absolutely not, Mark. A good Catholic would simply giggle at that and say, oh, poor Holy Father, he must have had a bad night. He wasn't sleeping well. Maybe he had indigestion, and it caused him to make such a silly, ridiculous remark.
Yeah.
Or a Catholic looking at a Vicar of Christ kissing an ice cube. My goodness, Catherine, they're looking at this.
I mean, we all love an ice cube, but
yeah, especially before dinner at that cocktail hour, it's a very nice. But the Vicar of Christ demeaning himself that way, you almost want to. One grits one's teeth and clenches one's fists and say, "Oh, I wouldn't be doing this," because the world is looking, Mark, and saying that this man of the highest office, church, why is he prostituting himself to the agenda of the left?
And this is what we've seen, isn't it, over the last few weeks? We've seen the was it the climate summit where Arnold Schwarzenegger stood up, and and then this week the horrendous. We've really grated on me that all the Hollywood celebrities coming to the Vatican and being welcomed, and there's no admonition given to them for the horrible. Every film now is just indiscriminate murder of people to solve problems, and promiscuity, and there's no mention of that. And the Pope gave this kind of speech where he referred to the films that he enjoyed. They were all 40 or 50 years old, which that's lovely, but I mean that in itself tells you everything you need to know about modern Hollywood. And it looks like these people are using the papacy to forward their own agenda, and thus undermining the true authority of the Vicar of Christ.
Clearly, it subtracts in the minds of the world his dignity and his authority in speaking on very important issues, because suddenly they're going to think, well, this trivialization which he's dealing with is unacceptable. What a perfect opportunity, as you just pointed out, Mark, for him to speak the truth to them and say, why don't you tell the real truth about life? Use this artistic form to communicate, as painters in the 15th century did, and some of our great novelists did, as Shakespeare did, as Dante did. What a moment for him to have said that to them and say, rise up from the grime of present day Hollywood. That would have been an act of papal caritas, of papal charity to them. And they would have listened. It could have been delivered with the gentlest of manner, and the whole world would have listened. And maybe at that point, Mark scratched their head and said, yes, Hollywood has been debasing art, because they use art to debase the human person and to debase the moral law, when followed, lifts the human person to heights that he would not known apart from that. I once wrote an article, you might have seen, Catherine, why I say that Hollywood must become the new 14th century Florence.
Wouldn't that be
wonderful? Would that be? But that's the purpose of art, Catherine.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Is to lift us and bring us to the heart of Christ. Pope Ratzinger, our beloved Pope Benedict XVI, once said that the two great marks of the divinity of the Church is her sacred liturgy and her saints and her great artistic heritage in music and in architecture. And how right he was. When anyone hears Gregorian chant or polyphony, I had a fellow who was in Rome for the first time on a pilgrimage, and he remarked to me on how overwhelmed he was when he went in each one of those Roman basilicas, and he saw the grandeur of Christ and the grandeur of his Holy Catholic Church, and he couldn't wait to go home and be about the work of bringing Christ's truth to the world. He was so inspired by that art.
And this is so needed now, because there's as Mark said, very subtle ways, and it's often presented in a beautiful way. I think a couple of years ago in Canada, they literally had an advert advertising assisted suicide, and they called it Life is Beautiful, and it was all, beautifully shot. And you think that's the danger. It's a bit, the devil presents as an angel of light, is that we're being presented in Hollywood with all this stuff that's drawing especially young, vulnerable people in and normalizing depravity, really. But if people could see, they're shielded from the consequences. So we're presented with films, movies that actually lie to us about the real consequences, because if you really showed people what happened when they made these choices, then it would be horrific. It would be horrible. Pope John Paul II, just before the turn of the century, wrote that letter to artists, and I thought that was brilliant. This is what needed, is this engagement, and say, no, it's Christ, it's the Christian culture that built this beautiful art, that has given us our beautiful bodies for a reason, and this is something that these Hollywood stars should go to the Pope and learn from him. But we're not seeing that.
Hollywood now is in the business of making wickedness palatable, as you perfectly put it. And the Church has to say, no, in a very real way, Mother Church created beauty, and because Christ is the beauty. And what you're doing is not beautiful. And this does not mean that our art can't be presenting the human predicament and all its ugliness and as a way of wanting to move out of it. So I think of the novels of Flannery O'Connor, or even of your own Graham Greene, in The End of the Affair, and some more sensitive Catholics might look at work like that and say, oh, it's entirely too immoral or brash. Look at the treatment to a war and Pride said revisited. But what these great Catholic novelists were doing is saying, this is the ugliness of sin. This is the ugliness of the world. And it only leads to despair. And it leads to a kind of, it leads to a debasement of the human person, a claustrophobia. And only the church can release you from this prison. It reminds me, Mark, of St. John of the Cross when he said in Descent of Mount Carmel, out of God, outside of God, everything is narrow. Yeah. And I would like to say, and suffocating. That's the purpose. So even when the novelist shows us some of the more unseemly aspects of the human condition, he's doing that in order to contrast it with the beatific life that a Catholic could lead when they are corresponding to grace and virtue.
Yeah. Good art does that. In fact, I just wrote recently, Father, for our publication about Friends, the sitcom Friends, and was critical of it. And I wasn't critical because I was arguing that we should never show the dark underbelly of human nature, as you've just pointed to some fantastic novels. But a good novelist, a good artist, is able to show the worst of human nature, but by way of revealing to you that you do not want to be left there, that then you want to be transformed. So for example, I think I say Edmond Dantes at the end of the Count of Monte Cristo believes that he can bring about justice, and at the end he is transformed and says, no, I've been playing God, it's divine justice, and we have to leave this in God's hands. So yes, it's not about hiding from the dark reality of our lives, but it's always saying, let's point to Christ, let's point to the light. And Flannery O'Connor does that brilliantly. Her novels, I think, show those moments where grace penetrates, and we either choose the light or we choose the darkness, and she doesn't shield from the consequences of those choices. So I agree with you. I think that's a brilliant assessment you've given there of the power of art done well.
It's so essential to our lives, or else our lives are going to be flat. God has given us art, and he has given man the power of doing artistic things for the whole purpose, one and sole purpose, to bring us to the heart of God. It's a highway to heaven. And art is indispensable, Catherine. Literary art, the art of music, and the art of sculpture and architecture. And look how all of it has been debased in the 20th century, especially modern art. My goodness. Yeah. That it's just, please God that young people will take if they have that artistic inclination, and start using it for God and giving us glorious art again. They're out there, these young people. They just have to be told. And maybe then these hideous refrigerator churches that have been constructed in the past 60 years, every one of them will be razed to the ground. Please, and then have Chartres and rebuilt again in their place.
It's almost like a veil has been drawn over the truth, the Catholic truth, and it's harder now for young people, especially, to discern, to find the real treasure of the faith underneath all this confusing secular modernist nonsense, isn't it? I find it really frustrating, and you spend hours then when people contact us through Catholic Unscripted and say, I'm worried about this, and then you're trying to unpeel the layers and explain to them, the beauty that's underneath. Part of that for me is this concept of a synodal church, and that's something you brought up in your article, where you express concern over, that particular phrase of Pope Leo: truth is not possessed but sought together, where you kind of see echoes of modernist thought. Do you think it's possible to reconcile this kind of language with classic Catholic understandings of objective truth? Or is this indicative of a deeper theological shift? What would that mean for how Catholics understand doctrine going forward?
That line is existential suicide.
Mm.
And that's what he's inviting Catholics to. I was absolutely shocked to see him write that. This is exactly the project of the modernists beginning in the late 19th century. And they imagine that if we could weaken truth or soften it enough so it no longer becomes something that summons us to the heights of what God made us to be, made in his image and likeness, and simply make it a private possession, otherwise known as one's feelings, we could begin to dismantle the whole notion, not only of Catholicism, Mark, but of religion itself, because we would no longer have any objectivity. That was there. And that's why St. Pope Pius X recognized the malice of this philosophical turn. And then it sifted into theology and called it modernism, and then named it the synthesis of all errors. Because if truth leaves us, if we don't think we can attain the truth, we're always seeking the truth, but not possessing the truth, then all of us are left to our own counsels. We're left to our own whims. We're left to our own feelings. And yours, Catherine, and yours, Mark, and mine are as good as Christ the King's.
And isn't it antithetical to the idea of a religion that is based on revelation? You know, we sit at the feet of Christ and listen to his word, don't we? And that reveals the truth of our existence. This, this can't sit in any peace with what, this sort of relativist agenda, can it?
No, of course not, Mark. And that's why his predecessor introduced synodal listening. That's at the bottom of it, Mark. Let's be clear. Let's be honest. That somehow we could work at this idea of the truth the way a child works at finger painting. And every day we'll come up with something different. But we have to recognize that we can discard that because tomorrow you may have something new. And so we move forward without the benefit of truth. And we look at the whole deposit of the faith, the Church's infallible teaching for 2,000 years, and can easily identify it as the thinking of another age that is easily disposed of. And we have to now introduce a whole new thinking. That's at the base of synodal listening. And if you don't think I'm right, listen to some of its main proponents, even those who hold the rank of cardinal, heaven forfend, who are being very open about this. What are they calling it, Catherine? Cardinal Newman, St. John Henry must be howling from heaven. They're taking his beautiful explicitated development of doctrine, where he refers to it in the way that St. Vincent of Lerins referred to it, as a deepening of the treasure of the faith, uncovering more and more of its beauty with each passing. Oh no, for the modernists, for the new interpret of development of doctrine, it means altering, it means alteration, it means twisting it out of any recognizable feature it might have had to the past. That's what synodal listening. Everything is up for grabs when they go on these synodal listening sessions. I cannot tell you how frightened I was on the day of Pope Leo's election. I was happy when he was able to emerge on the loggia dressed in proper pontifical vestments, and then I was dejected when he told the world he would continue the legacy of his predecessor of synodal listening. I said, oh no.
And he's just recently said Mary is a synodal woman.
Oh, we should have told me that, Catherine.
Yeah.
You've ruined my entire day. This
Sorry.
must be a happy interview. I don't keep up on a lot of these things. Only I'm trying to maintain my peace, and now I have to do another article, Catherine. A synodal woman.
Co-redemptrix is out. Synodal woman is in.
That's right. Even though he, in a recent article I read about a month ago, did indeed use the title co-redemptrix. I don't know what, I can't give you the verse and the day. He himself used it. It just seems to me he's being torn on the one side by certain cardinals of the left who are saying you'll continue this process of demolition, quiet demolition. And maybe his instinct on the other side is, I don't know how wise that might be. So I think we find a pope who's conflicted.
There is a Christological turn in the papacy, I think, that's very notable, isn't there? A lot of the time he talks about recentering things on Christ, which is a positive turn.
We're happy for little things we get.
Yeah.
We're happy for the scraps that fall from the table at this point in our lives, Catherine. And we rejoice and thank God for his mercy that he's given us a scrap. And you're right, Mark, so many things I hear from him seem to be laudable and a return to our Lord. On the Feast of Corpus Christi, we were so thrilled that he walked through some of the cities of Rome, holding the sacred monstrance under a canopy. We had not seen that in decades, certainly not in the pontificate of his predecessor. Isn't it interesting? I hope Catholics contrast that motion of the Pope on Corpus Christi with some successors of the apostles in the United States of America who forbade public processions of the Blessed Sacrament and are publicly forbidding Catholics to give reverence to our Lord in the Holy Eucharist when they receive Holy Communion. Again, confusing Catholics because they must be saying, but St. Peter knelt in adoration before Christ. Depart from me, a sinful man. One of the rulers and the centurions knelt before Christ in adoration. And now certain successors of the apostles, Mark, are saying, oh, forget that. We're men of a new age. We don't do that anymore. Aren't they terrified of facing Christ in judgment?
It's like a glimpse of the demonic for me. Like, who on earth would say that? What bishop could possibly say, let's have less devotion to Christ? It just doesn't make any sense, does it?
Yeah, they'll twist the whole idea of devotion. They make it be something that it never meant to be. That's how they get for. But there are successors of the apostles in America who are doing that. Easy to find out who they are. I don't want to mention their names, but you're right. Pope Benedict XVI, beloved Pope Benedict, he wrote the book, The Spirit of Liturgy, and in there he related the story of one of the Desert Fathers. His name escapes me, and he had a vision of the devil. I recall this story, and it was hideous. But the one thing that struck him most in this movement in this appearance of the devil before him was the fact that he possessed no knees.
So that tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it, really?
It gives you the chills. He was capable of bowing before God. And that's where at that point, the Pope said, doesn't this frighten us? That lack of reverence for our Lord and the Holy Eucharist can be called, without fear of being melodramatic, demonic. I know intelligent Catholics, as we try to stay away from that use of that term too much because it's been bandied about all too frequently in these days. Not even being ever so careful and circumspect. I think in this instance, we are right, Mark, in saying it is demonic to forbid Catholics to kneel before God.
Yeah, there's definitely that stripping away of the supernatural. I know Catholics who say, oh, yes, I believe in miracles, but every baby, every sunset is a miracle. Every beautiful horizon is a miracle. And yes, I believe in the devil and sin, but sometimes it can be in the form of bipolar disorder, and you make the devil, you make it some mental illness, you make a miracle some beautiful view, and the supernatural is just gone. The vertical is stripped away, and everything is horizontalized. And to see that kind of language in the church is difficult for Catholics, and which is why your article is so important. And you said you hope you've hit the mark. I think you did, definitely. I think you managed to show that we must have reverence for our Holy Father, but we also need clarity.
I hope that was the message being communicated to Catholics, because we have to love them all. We have to recognize the circumstance they've been thrust into, and somehow with gentleness, the kind of gentleness our Lord showed to sinners, we have to raise them up. That is the whole purpose of why I write and preach. I recognize that sometimes I become angry at those who are hurting the little ones. My brother was recently listening to one of my sermons last week, and he phoned me and said, "I like your sermons." I said, "Thank you." He said, "But aren't you a little bit angry?" And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't want to communicate anger. I said, I thought I was being firm or emphatic, but I wouldn't want to frighten Catholics by appearing angry. But sometimes the mischief of the leftist priests do make me angry, Catherine. And I hope our Lord forgives me for showing sometimes that anger, but now from the admonition of my brother, I'll try to be less angry, Mark.
Do you know, I would give you a word of comfort there, Father. And I'd say that the thing is, right, if you're a man's man and you've got the kind of towering intellect that you've got, and it comes across so easy, and that's not, I'm not trying to gild the lily or anything, that it can seem like if you speak precisely like that, that is intimidating to the modern mind. I think, they can feel that can come across as anger. But like you say, you're being emphatic. I think most people are really overjoyed to hear you speaking in that way. So thank you so much for it.
You're kind, Mark. But I want to topple all the idols. The way David toppled Goliath. You might think, Catherine, that's overly romantic of me, but that's how I see the vocation of the priest. He has to protect the little ones. I wrote that article several years ago, Catherine, called "The Priest as Hercules," and he has to be. I keep on telling. I'll be preaching a retreat in 2 weeks to men, and I often tell them that I'm your protector. I'm Hercules. I am here to carry you and protect you from all those beasts that are outside, and I'm hopefully giving you the spiritual and intellectual armament to go out and to carry on that fight against them. And go find those little ones who are abandoned by those who should be shepherds and carry them back to Christ.
That's wonderful. A lot of this is resonating with me, Catherine, with our conversation with Bishop Strickland. I don't know if you noticed that, Father. And I think
I'm a great admirer of him.
Honest to goodness, and he lacks. I think he'd be the first. I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't accept. That he's not got the intellectual gifts, perhaps, that you have. But he seems to have been on a journey. His honesty is so clear, and his conscience really speaks through his actions, and he seems to have reasoned himself to a position. And he's saying a lot of these things about the little ones and the job of a shepherd, to guard the little ones. So that's very interesting, isn't it, Catherine, that there's a connection there.
Yeah, and I would also say, although one has to be watchful for anger, misplaced anger, it's a righteous anger. It's a righteous anger. And I think of a father with his children in a family. If you see your children threatened, if you see your children in danger and being led away, you are going to defend them. And you're not necessarily going to be wet and nice about it. You're just
a duty. It's a terrible duty, but it's a duty, isn't it?
People are hungry. You said at the beginning, Father, and I think you were absolutely spot on. Yes, we think of hunger, the distended bellies of the sort of 1980s Live Aid that we saw in the terrible famine in Ethiopia, and of course there's that type of poverty, but we have real impoverishment of our souls, the distended souls that you speak of. People are hungry. They are hungry. And when we speak with good, solid priests, Orthodox priests like yourself, we have so many people, don't we, Mark, emailing us saying, please, can you invite Father Perricone back on? Please, can you share with us the links to his work? Because there is this great need. So I would certainly want to encourage you and say you what you say, how you speak, how you write, and your ministry as a priest is completely valued and needed.
Thank you, Catherine. I remember, and Catholics must remember the words of St. Paul to the Corinthians when he actually mandates us, be angry, but do not sin. Aquinas, when he's discussing the virtue of fortitude of the Summa, Mark, under the cardinal virtue of fortitude, he says that it is our obligation to pounce upon evil and destroy it. And that means that we must become angry. St. John Chrysostom says somewhere, Catherine, that it is a sin not to become angry when we see evil.
And you do wonder, Father, whether the number of people being critical have read the gospel, because the gospel is not a hippie Jesus dancing around Galilee with a flower chain around his head. No. He is angry with sin and how it destroys people and what it does to people, and wants to call them to something better, to call them to love, call them to a relationship with his Father. This is the reality of the gospel. So you want people know the gospel.
A perfect example, really, of the position that we're in is if you watch Bishop Strickland address the US Bishops' Conference, and he's saying this is a matter of doctrine about, Father James Martin, and they're just like,
yeah, next.
Yeah. No, ho hum. Next.
Yeah.
Next
Did I drop something?
Let's talk about illegal immigration.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Bishop Strickland is our St. John Fisher. I have to say it more.
Yeah.
And my goodness, I know there's a priest thinking of writing an article about, I guess you saw that Instagram of the bishops after their meeting, one after another, talking about, we have to cry out and be illegal. Well, I think there's a priest thinking about writing an article about the bishops, and he's entitling it Racing to Irrelevancy. You might want to look out for that article.
Yeah.
Well, you'll find it, right?
And when we do, we will be sharing it here, won't we, Mark?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, as always, Father, it's been wonderful to have you join us this afternoon, and I've enjoyed the conversation. The time flies by, and I hope you'll join us again in conversation soon. And we'll put all the links below, so do visit Father's own webpage and check out his articles and get that book, Torches Against the Abyss.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Catherine. I hope I'm not wearing out my welcome by being on so frequently.
No, come back anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitations. God bless.
Thank you.